Hello, everyone. How are you doing? And welcome to another episode of the Dr. Will Show, where we have the discussions about innovation, leadership, and becoming the CEO of you. Each week, I bring on a thought leader, practitioner, or content creator, and we discuss ideas and strategies that assist you in living your best life. Today's episode will be on the opportunity gap, and our guest is Julia Freeland Fisher. How are you doing, Julia?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being a guest on the show. Of course, people, if you are unfamiliar with Julia, she is awesome, a great writer for the Christensen Institute, which people, if you're not familiar with, is known for disruption and the things that they write about as well. So we're going to be talking about this article. The questions will come from this article that Julia actually wrote that I said, whoa, is this interesting? Because a lot of people, when they talk about school reform or changes in education, they talk about everything but this. And I think that this is more important than the other stuff because I think this cuts to the core of self-efficacy and all those other things. So will you please introduce yourself, Julia?
Sure. Well, you already gave me a bit of an introduction, but my name is Julia Freeland Fisher. I am the Director of Education Research at the Clayton Christensen Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that studies innovation in the public sector. And in our education practice, we try and take the trial and error out of education innovation. We try and give educators and leaders in the system strategies to actually innovate deliberately and in ways that create a more student-centered and effective system. And what we'll be talking about today with Dr. Will is my most recent research project, which really focuses on innovations that expand students' access to social capital, networks, and relationships that can help them further their potential.
Excellent. So before we get into your article, let's set the scene. Technology is rapidly changing in industries and creating new ones. That said, one of the oldest industries is education, and it is just holding on real tight and digging in and not wanting to ride this wave of transformation. How has the present construct of school that as we know it, actually created or sustained the opportunity gap that you wrote about in your article?
Sure, yeah. Well, and this is an area that the Christensen Institute has focused on for a long time, which is sort of how is the design of our system holding us back? And I think it's on a couple big fronts. On the one hand, and we know this all too well from the data, schools aren't particularly well designed to tackle achievement gaps, much less opportunity gaps, right? And I would say that on the achievement gap side, even our tradition of social promotion, meaning that we move students through grades based on their age, that has led to us, I would argue, tolerating achievement gaps because students move on regardless of mastery. I don't know if folks saw, we can link to this afterwards, the article in NPR recently on Ballou High School up in the DC area where I live, and it's a perfect illustration of students actually graduating high school, but without the academic mastery or achievement that we would like to see associated with that progression or graduation. So we have a core problem on the academic side of the house that we're moving students through school regardless of academic mastery. And I would argue that rather than blaming teachers for that, it's that we have structures in place where one teacher has to attempt to teach a large cohort of same-age students who may range in mastery levels, and we're sort of ill-equipped to differentiate to those needs. Now, that's the achievement gap. What I sort of would argue on this broader idea of the opportunity gap is that schools are even less well-equipped to address the social supports that students may need. And that's partly because we've siloed poverty relief efforts as separate from school. It's partly because we haven't infused schools with informal and formal mentors, even though that we know that there are big gaps in students' access to those. It's partly because we haven't addressed enrichment spending gaps, which are rapidly growing between our richest and poorest families. it's partly because geographic segregation is worsening by income, and it's no surprise that that impacts schools. And so I think that schools by design suffer the results of sort of structural issues that broader society is facing, but we haven't given them the instructional tools or the social tools to address those gaps.
I hear you, and it's so interesting because, being that my day job is in K through 12,
Yep.
I see it where kids that should not go on, and they become the problem of the teacher in the next grade. And when they barely make it there, then they become the problem of that teacher in the next grade, where all of a sudden a kid who is in the 10th grade has a 187 RIT score on the NWEA, and the teacher is like, what am I supposed to do with this? Because I'm teaching my subject area on grade level.
Yep.
It will be tested on grade level, and they can't read what I'm trying to teach.
Absolutely.
So Nicholas Kristof, people, very famous writer, said that talent is universal, but opportunity isn't. You wrote Disrupting Opportunity Gaps Will Hinge on Networks. What is an opportunity gap, and where did the actual research or the idea of your article come from?
Sure. Well, just to riff on like your last example, which I think is exactly right. It's what educators are experiencing every day. And I think what we have to what has to wake us up is that the idea that the student becomes someone's problem rather than society's asset is really where we're both missing and I think misconstruing the issue. And by that, I mean, like, if we don't understand that our students are our greatest asset for our future, then we are investing in the wrong thing. What prompted me to write this article, I'll go into a little background and then I'll describe what I mean by opportunity gap. What prompted me to write this article was research out of Stanford by a researcher named Raj Chetty and his team. And if you guys haven't read his stuff, it's very compelling if you're interested in looking at sort of the landscape of opportunity in America writ large. But what Chetty and his team found in this particular study was a phenomenon that they dubbed lost Einsteins, which was that there were students who showed high potential in STEM subjects at a young age who did not end up pursuing careers in innovation and invention. And what they were able to show was actually a stark difference between those students who were living in geographies with high exposure to invention and innovation in those industries and geographies with low exposure. And that actually didn't correlate with talent or potential talent as shown in their sort of academic outcomes and test scores. What that tells us, right, is that just like Kristof said, talent and opportunity are not one and the same. And we have to sort of wake up in our education system and understand that those students who may in later grades be showing up as problem students may have in earlier grades possessed all the same potential as those students who don't present as problem students. And yet we don't have a system that's designed to potentially sort of cultivate, nurture, and double down on that potential. So the opportunity gap, it's real complex. I don't think I'm going to do it justice, because we could look at all sorts of data. I think that study shows a great microcosm of it. I think I've already alluded to other areas where we can see resource differentials like enrichment spending. That's really, I mean, we're at like a 6x differential between our most affluent and our poorest students in terms of what their families can spend on enrichment. And you look at how that plays out in college application processes, in exposure to knowledge economy jobs, and we are setting up a whole generation for unequal access to opportunity. The last thing I'll say, sorry, I could talk about this for 3 hours and we have not that much time, but the last thing I'll say that I'm actually writing a book on this topic, and I frame part of the book, in fact, at the very beginning, around the concept of meritocracy. Because I think that this is really crucial when we talk about opportunity in America. We can sort of wave our hands and say we're a meritocracy. Meritocracy is a concept that was made up by a British sociologist in 1958, right? In an era when many of our parents were alive. And yet America blindly has adopted this idea that we are a meritocracy, that it is a sound way of structuring a society. And we have done that ignoring the fact that access to opportunity is not equal. So as long as there are lost Einsteins, like what Chetty found, we are not actually living in a true meritocracy, and we need to sort of check ourselves on that. And I would argue, and hopefully this is what we'll talk about for the rest of the episode, I think that we need radical innovations in how we distribute opportunity if we want to truly subscribe to this idea of meritocracy.
Mm-hmm. And the interesting about that is that, there's cognitive dissonance with that because you'll have people who are poor whites in Virginia and the hills somewhere else who will believe in that, but yet they still go work in the coal mine. Their children work in the coal mine. Their children work in the coal mine. And they don't understand that the reason that this is happening is because on the economic level, you are not growing. You're not building wealth. You're not passing down generational wealth. And your schools are as substandard and offer, in terms of whether it be academics or extracurriculars, just like schools in DC. It's just that the color of the people are different, but the circumstances are the same. And they don't seem to quite get it that they're in the same boat.
Absolutely. And that I think there's a component to a belief in meritocracy that subscribes to the notion that schools are leveling the playing field. And I would argue, to your point, that schools in both of those sorts of geographies need to radically innovate if they are truly going to level the playing field in our country. And they may need to innovate in different ways depending on their circumstances.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So from healthcare to educational attainment to career trajectory, the haves and the have-nots, all of this can be traced back to economics. What can schools do to address the opportunity gaps, especially those schools that are Title I schools?
Yeah, again, could talk about this for like an hour. So Dr. Will, you got to cut me off if I'm going on for too long. But I would say this is the crucial question. And I would say this is actually the question that we have failed to tackle even under the past many, many years of No Child Left Behind and sort of purporting to try and redistribute dollars through levers like Title I. And this is a crucial question because schools actually lack the levers, the resources, and the structures to fundamentally address poverty. And poverty fundamentally erects barriers to learning and thriving. And I want to highlight one example where I think there's hope, and then I'll get to the opportunity piece, because I think that before we address some of these fundamentals, we're not actually going to be able to address poverty. So I would point you to a group called City Connects. Have you heard of this group? They're out of Boston.
I haven't.
So City Connects is a very well-researched program that was born out of the Boston College School of Education, headed up by a professor named Mary Walsh. And City Connects is premised on the idea that until we integrate social services into schools that can lift these barriers to learning, we're going to see persistent achievement gaps. And the basic structure, I'll let you guys Google it and read up about it, but the basic structure is that in tandem with the educators, the leaders, and the community members around schools, City Connects actually coordinates at the level of individual students a network of care and support. And that actually allows for the sorts of resources that students may need, whether it's after school help, whether it's healthcare, whether it's additional family engagement, allows for this sort of SWAT team approach to really bringing to bear the resources that students need in their lives to thrive. And I won't rattle on, but the data is incredible about what they're able to produce. After leaving City Connects, elementary school students outperform their peers on middle school state tests and standard achievement tests. They're particularly effective with ELL students in the Boston area. And even most compelling is that when these children are followed into high school, the dropout rate is reduced by half for children who are in City Connect schools. So really compelling evidence that what's now referred to in the literature as integrated student supports is a big part of this equation, and it's the exception, not the rule, in most elementary and middle schools. Now, when we get to that's talking about just achievement gaps, right? And I want to acknowledge there's a difference. Let's talk about opportunity gaps for a second. There's really compelling research out of the Brookings Institute about what's been dubbed economic despair, which is that in areas of the highest levels of income inequality, you actually see students, and even more disproportionately males, less likely to invest in their education, more likely to drop out. And the explanation that the researchers posit is that they are witnessing all around them lack of opportunity. And so what would typically be assumed to be the rational economic behavior to invest in your human capital actually disappears, because you don't actually see that investment playing out in the adults' lives around you because there's a lack of opportunity. That actually begets a whole other set of interventions we need to be thinking about. Beyond these integrated student supports that provide poverty relief, we need to be thinking about what is the sort of ring of opportunity and hope and inspiration through mentors, through exposure to the knowledge economy, through exposure to opportunity that these students are allowed to access in order to inspire them to invest in themselves, to invest in their education, and to also chart a path into that knowledge economy. And I think that's it's separate from the achievement gap, right? Because we're not just talking about how to increase test scores, which is important. We're talking about how to increase investment in yourself and in a better future.
Yeah, the late great Biggie said, in the neighborhood he comes from, either you slinging crack rock or you got a wicked jump shot, because those are the people they actually see
from an exposure standpoint.
Sort of making a come up, as we say. And so that's really important. I remember years ago, I kept writing when I did blog. I like podcasting much better. But to talk about, and even with the students at our schools, that when they sort of know themselves, and I try to bring it to them from two perspectives, entrepreneurship and from the end of, okay, Black man, do you know who you are? Like, we need, understand your history, understand who you come from, understand that there is greatness that lies within you, and we need to take that next level. Because I understand that once that sort of understanding of self and belief comes, the greats take care of themselves because they're going to put in the work.
Yep. And I would argue, just to add a layer to that. So I actually am working on this book with my husband, which is its own adventure that we could have a different podcast about. But one thing, we're constantly talking about access to relationships, but we sort of landed partway through the process with this aha of, to be in relationship with others, you also have to be in good relationship with yourself, right? That's sort of a basic truth of human psychology and sociology. And I think that's the point you're making. My hope is that if schools can help students be in good relationship with themselves, then they can also expand their networks way beyond their current networks into new avenues of opportunity. Because like rubber hits the road, 50% of jobs come through personal connections in our country. And we got to own that fact, and we have to network students into opportunity. We have to first network them into themselves to have that positive identity, and then we have to say, to even the playing field, you also need access to networks of opportunity, which is the sort of premise of the original piece that we're talking about today.
So if exposure and geography contribute to the opportunity gap, how can technology, devices, laptops, tablets, along with access to high-speed internet in the classroom, provide students with mentors they need? And what are some of the tools that are available?
Absolutely. So again, and stop me if I'm going into like a research wonky hole, because that's that's what I risk doing here. So City Connects, the model I just described, which is all about sort of high touch student supports, that's imbuing students and sort of doubling down in students' lives on their strongest ties, the relationships and the resources that can help them get by and start to thrive academically. In sociology, there's also a term called your weak ties, which is your mere acquaintances. And there's a really powerful fact around weak ties, which is dubbed the strength of weak ties, which is that actually many of our job opportunities end up coming through our weak tie networks because those networks are more diverse. And I say this to point out that the real power of technology is not to start to replace our strong ties. It's not that you're going to have your closest friends and mentors be these like random online relationships. It's that technology has the power to diversify our weak tie networks. And that's a critical conduit to opportunity. So when we've looked at this landscape of where technology is playing, technology is best suited to do just that, to introduce you to experts in industries who you may never otherwise have met. And I'll give a quick example of that in a second. To introduce you to mentors who may be able to help you navigate the college application process or the college success process. To introduce you to tutors and sort of on-demand homework help when you're struggling. And so it's those sort of brief encounters that may seem really paltry compared to a rich in-person nurturing relationship, but that are actually gateways to opportunities. Couple examples, and I call a few of these out in the article that you're speaking to here. One is a group called Nepris out of Texas, and it's founded by a former Texas Instruments manager named Sabari Raja, who's a phenomenal entrepreneur and who saw this potential of closing exposure gaps and relevance gaps by introducing students to more mentors in the STEM field. Teachers can log on to Nepris and essentially find all sorts of experts in all sorts of fields that they can port into their classrooms over video. And Sabari often tells a really powerful story of a group of students in rural Texas who were speaking to a neurosurgeon in New York City. And not only were they allowed to get exposure to neuroscience, which many of them had no exposure to, they also said to this neurosurgeon, like, can you point the computer out the window so we can see the skyline? Right? And it shows you the power of networking students into these new people and contexts and circumstances to which they otherwise might not have exposure, at least as young people growing up. A lot of other tools, happy to like share more of them. EduCurious is a great tool that's project-based learning paired with video experts. Community Share is a great platform that's trying to pair local community resources with teachers. Connect with STEM is doing the same thing. But all to say, there's a lot of technology plays out there trying to think about how do we network students into opportunity through these sort of weak tie connections.
Mm-hmm. And it's very powerful. You know, my wife teaches gifted, and she always does these career units with her students. And once she was doing one, and she told her students, we're going to be talking to Dr. Wilson. And she sort of asked, what do you think about Dr. Wilson? And before they even saw Dr. Wilson, they thought Dr. Wilson was white and male. Mm. And when they saw Dr. Wilson and found out that she was black and female, her kids like, oh.
Yep.
Oh. And they were able to find out what she did to run a cancer lab and see her lab. And for her, for her students, that changes things when you can see, wow.
The perspective shift.
That's possible.
Yep.
So that's one.
Yeah. And so what I'm trying to push on my research is that we both need, again, let me go wonky for 1 second here. Forgive me.
Okay.
So we need students to have role models who look like them. That is actually a well-studied phenomenon, right? There's like airtight research on that. There's also a sociological phenomenon called homophily, which is that similarity breeds connection. I am more likely to trust someone who I perceive to be like me. Mm. Now, like me can mean a whole lot of things. You are like me because we care about education reform, clearly, or at least I'm projecting that onto you because you invited me onto your show, right? You may be like me because of other hobbies or tastes we have that we have not yet surfaced. And I think that particularly for these online tools, we've got to think critically and deliberately about designing opportunities for seemingly unlike people to surface similarity and to therefore forge trust. And we're going to suddenly have the opportunity not just to trust and sort of be inspired by people who look like us, but by people who also share other traits with us, by people who may have hidden similarities with us. And I think that's a really powerful both and, right? Again, like I'm not sort of pushing on the assumption that students don't need mentors that look like them. That is, again, super well studied. I want to say that, and let's start to find similarity across seeming areas of difference, because I would argue our society needs that right now. And these tools are an opportunity to do that. And you better believe that the Facebooks of the world are not helping us do that right now.
Oh, yes. So let's close the interview with your call to action for school leaders who day in, day out, put their energy on testing and raising test scores. But the opportunity gap may or may not be on their radar. I don't think it's much because of what I continually see and hear teachers talk about. How important is it to address the opportunity gap in relation to the academic achievement gap? And what can schools put in place to introduce students to those networks that will allow them to build those relationships with themselves and others?
Absolutely. So I guess I just want to start off saying, and you alluded to this, I believe that schools and teachers want what's best for their students, and they are trying to solve an exceedingly complex problem and level an exceedingly complex playing field. But their toolkit is fundamentally limited, and just better textbooks or great teaching can't always override the structural and geographic constraints that their students and families are facing. And so I'll say, like 3-4 years ago when I started this research project, I thought I was going to be writing about technology. And I've actually ended up writing mostly about institutional design and the design of what schools would need to look like to tackle that complex playing field. And so if you're actually day in, day out working in these schools, I think it's a design question. And I think you have to ask yourself, in my particular context, what are the opportunity assets that my students possess, and what are the opportunity deficits? How can I integrate student supports like that City Connects model to fundamentally address core barriers to learning? And what are the tools I can start to pull into my classroom, just like your wife did, that may just be a few minutes, right? A few minutes a day, a few minutes a week, but that start to pull on the boundaries of my students' inherited networks that are by definition limited. And my inherited network is limited and their inherited networks are limited, right? That's not a sort of normative political statement, but start to expand their horizons in ways with pretty cheap technology, right? But relatively cheap. We're talking right now on Zoom conference, right? And it's like not perfect resolution, although I look crazy because it's the end of the day. So I'm glad it's a little fuzzy, but like technology, this is not a technology problem. We have the technology at our fingertips to connect to human beings all over the world. And it's a question of, can you start pulling those in little a day, a little a week, a little a month, so that students' horizons start to gradually expand beyond the geographies and networks that they were born into, and to also strengthen those local networks as well, to reach out to experts and business people in your community and start to pull them into your classroom. And I fully acknowledge that when you're trying to make your way through this week's standards, like you can feel like time is limited, but I think that that it could be a tiny lift with a big payoff.
I hear you. I mean, that's why I just believe in just getting rid of most of these standards.
Oh, we're gonna veer off into that now.
I'm just saying, you know, when you look at Common Core, you go, are you kidding me? Like, let's scale down, pare down some of this stuff. Like it's far too many. And then when people look at what's important, you know, I've done a podcast interview before, and the guy asked me, he said, well, what do you think? I said, we need numeracy. Mm-hmm. You know, you don't need algebra 3 to graduate from high school. I'm sorry. Some people may think it's that, but if I have no interest in going to a 4-year institution where I don't have the aptitude that would allow me to be successful in a certain environment, why am I required to take algebra 3? Which, if I do pass that course, I'm going to barely pass it. And in high school is not going to be something that I want to be a part of. I mean, when people talk about school choice, I love it in terms of, like, let's say Boston, for example, right? I lived there for 3 years. You know what I loved about Boston? There was the John D. O'Brien School, public school, but it was a math and science school. So if you were a kid and you say, hey, I love that, and you passed the test, you got in. Boston Ridge and Latin, another school that if you get your test, you in. They have a performing arts high school in there. So those schools, it doesn't matter where you live, you can still go to a school that best fits sort of, hey, this is what I'm trying to accomplish out of life. This is what I have a passion for. We need more of that, in my opinion, and more competency based and more or less.
Yep.
Here's the ABC of everything we think you should learn, and then put that on kids.
And I would argue, per what you just said, it's the combination, and we advocate for this in our research that I feel like I'm plugging unnecessarily. I'm not trying to plug it, but like the combination of online learning, competency-based progressions, and project-based learning that unlocks all of those possibilities, right? I mean, I think to answer your original question, what can a teacher do tomorrow? You can pull in some of these experts on video chat, right? What can a teacher do in the long term? Like, hopefully pivot to a system that's actually flexible in all the ways you just described, so that each individual student is charting his path. And that we're, again, optimizing for that individual student's opportunity. We're not basing it on age-based, cohort-based progression. We're not basing it on these sort of monolithic categories that we're stuck in today.
I hear you. So, I know I veered off on that, but
I think it's all related. I mean, I think you're speaking to what is the structure of school we need. And I think that structure that you're describing starts to unlock more opportunities in the way that we've been talking about for the past 40 minutes or so.
Excellent. So thank you again, Julia, for being a guest on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You are welcome. People, you know how I do this. This is going up on SoundCloud and iTunes. I need you to visit. I need you to listen, download, subscribe, leave a message. Share this with everybody you know. I need you to go check out the video cast on YouTube. Do the same. Look, you may be driving. You're like, when I lived in Boston, I had a nice commute to work. So on doing that commute, let's get some knowledge in and share with everyone. And this information I'll be putting out there where you can get in contact with Julia on Twitter, strike up the conversation, and be prepared to buy her book, because we're all waiting on it. Because now I am like, because a lot of education books, particularly when we talk about what is school, they don't talk about what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the plug, and follow Dr. Will.
Awesome. So people, as always, invest in you, EDU, peace.